Forget everything you think you know about ancient economies, because today we are diving deep into a system that built the pyramids, fed millions for millennia, and operated without a single coin for most of its history. We're going to explore the economic engine of ancient Egypt, a model so stable, so fundamentally tied to the very earth it sprang from, that it essentially ran on wheat and barley. This is the story of the grain standard, and it begins, as all things in Egypt do, with the Nile River. Imagine standing on the banks of this mighty, life-giving river thousands of years ago. You're not looking at a mere waterway. You're looking at the ultimate economic indicator. Every year, like clockwork, the Nile flooded, depositing a rich, black silt, the legendary kemet, that guaranteed an astonishing bounty. This predictability, this annual miracle of agricultural excess, is the bedrock upon which the entire Egyptian state was constructed. Without this massive, reliable surplus of grain, the pharaohs could never have commanded the labor for their monumental works. The scribes could not have kept their intricate records, and the priests could not have maintained the vast temple complexes. The grain wasn't just food, it was currency, it was capital, it was the national reserve. For a remarkable period of over 2,000 years, the ancient Egyptians did not use coin money. Their entire economic life, from the smallest market transaction to the largest state project, relied on a system of barter and an established, standardized unit of account. While many different goods were bartered, from fish and beer to linen and copper, the ultimate, most stable unit of value was grain. Specifically, they used a measure of grain called the khar as the base for agricultural transactions, and a more refined unit, the deben, for valuable commodities like metals. A deben was theoretically the weight of a specific quantity of copper, but even this copper value was often expressed in terms of grain it could purchase, creating a seamless, interconnected system. Think of the deben as the closest thing they had to a dollar. It was a universally accepted accounting unit, but the actual cash exchange for most people and most goods was a basket of grain. If a craftsman wanted to buy a pair of sandals, the sandals might be valued at 3 deben. The craftsman might not possess 3 deben of copper. Instead, he would pay with an equivalent value in barley, perhaps 6 large sacks worth. This is the grain standard in its purest form. Grain wasn't just used as money, it was the real value behind all other measures. This reliance on a perishable commodity as a primary economic driver necessitated an incredibly sophisticated system of state control and management. Because the grain was the lifeblood and the medium of exchange, the state had an absolute, vital interest in controlling every aspect of its life cycle, from planning and harvesting to storage and, most importantly, redistribution. This is where the true genius of the Egyptian economic system lies. It was a planned economy centered on massive granaries. The pharaoh, through his viziers and an extensive bureaucracy of scribes, became the ultimate banker and risk manager for the entire nation. The granaries weren't just simple storage sheds. They were the national banks, strategically located near centers of population and power, such as capital cities and major temple complexes. The great temples, in fact, often function as vast economic centers in their own right, managing huge tracts of land and collecting vast amounts of grain that they would then use to pay their priests, craftsmen, and laborers. The state thus controlled the money supply by controlling the physical supply of grain. When the annual harvest was good, the granaries filled, the reserves grew, and the state had the resources to embark on large-scale building projects. When the harvest was poor, the reserves were drawn upon, buffering the population against famine and ensuring social stability. The most direct and unavoidable interaction every Egyptian had with the state-controlled economy was through taxation. And just as the standard was grain, the taxes were paid in kind, meaning they were paid not in abstract value, but in the actual products of the land. Farmers, the vast majority of the population, paid a portion of their annual harvest, primarily grain, directly to the state granaries. Craftsmen might pay in the products they created, such as sandals, linen, or tools. Fishermen and hunters would pay with portions of their catch. The system of in-kind payment meant that the state was perpetually gathering a massive, diverse inventory of every product the country produced. The state wasn't just collecting taxes to fund itself. It was literally stocking the world's largest supply chain warehouse. This enormous collection of goods was then used for the state's massive payroll. Royal workmen, soldiers, priests, and government officials were all paid in rations, a fixed allotment of goods that usually consisted of grain, which they could use for food or as currency, as well as bread, beer, and sometimes oil, fish, or linen. The system was beautifully circular. The land produced a tax. The tax became the wage, and the wage became the currency used in daily life. This sophisticated, centralized control over the entire economic cycle is the definitive feature of the ancient Egyptian system, a system that values stability and predictability above all else, ensuring the survival and prosperity of its citizens under the watchful eye of the Pharaoh. The entire magnificent edifice of the Egyptian economy, resting so precariously yet so successfully upon mountains of grain, would have collapsed into chaos had it not been for one key figure: the scribe. The scribe was not just a person who could write. He was the accountant, the tax collector, the payroll master, the inventory manager, and the legal clerk, all rolled into one. He was the vital artery of the state bureaucracy, operating under the assumption that if it wasn't recorded, it didn't exist. In a coinless economy dependent on measuring, collecting, and distributing physical commodities, the precision of the record-keeping was arguably more important than the gold in any later society's vault. The scribes were trained rigorously in mathematics, geometry, and the complex hieratic script, specifically focusing on the intricacies of weights, measures, and calculating agricultural yields. They used the simple but effective tools of papyrus, reed pens, and ink to maintain the national ledger, tracking every bushel of barley that entered the granary and every loaf of bread that was paid out as a wage. This immense bureaucratic effort was necessary because the state needed to standardize value in a world of physical goods. We discussed the khar as a measure of grain and the deben as a standard unit of account. Let's look closer at how they functioned in daily life. The khar was a specific volumetric measure, roughly equivalent to 76.88 liters of grain. This was the fundamental unit for assessing agricultural taxes, and often for major sales of grain. But when an Egyptian wanted to price something that wasn't grain, say a piece of furniture, a copper tool, or a day's labor, they used the deben. The deben was a weight, typically about 91 grams, often associated with copper, silver, or gold, but it primarily functioned as an abstract denomination. Imagine a price tag that says 5 deben. It doesn't mean you must pay with 5 deben of copper. It means the item's value is equivalent to the purchasing power of 5 deben of metal, and you could pay with anything that was valued at 5 deben, most often sacks of grain drawn from your state wages. This ability to convert and equate the value of everything, from a jar of ointment to a cow, back to a standardized, universally accepted unit, allowed the barter system to operate with remarkable efficiency and fairness. The scribes were the gatekeepers of these conversions, ensuring a smooth and consistent economic reality across the vast kingdom. Perhaps the most fascinating and foundational element of this grain standard economy was the concept of the ration wage system. This was the state's payroll, the method by which hundreds of thousands of individuals, from the highest officials to the lowliest manual laborers, were compensated. Everyone who worked for the Pharaoh, whether building a tomb, sailing a ship, or managing a temple, was paid in rations. These rations were standardized, predictable, and mostly composed of the most essential commodities: bread and beer. We often forget that ancient beer was not the bubbly beverage we know today. It was thick, nutritious, and a crucial source of calories, safer to drink than water, and made from a very barley that formed the currency. A typical unskilled laborer, such as a state quarryman or agricultural worker, might receive 2 large loaves of bread and 2 jars of beer per day, supplemented by specific quantities of grain, vegetables, and fish, often doled out weekly or monthly. Higher skilled workers, like the elite tomb builders at Deir el-Medina, famously received significantly higher wages, perhaps 4 times the basic ration, and their payments might include linen, copper, and better cuts of meat. This system accomplished 3 critical economic functions simultaneously. First, it was wage payment. Second, it was the distribution of wealth. The state was constantly recirculating commodities it collected through taxation. And third, because these wages were paid in the very commodities that served as currency, the grain/barley, the state was constantly injecting the money supply into the hands of the people. This was a direct, tangible economy. When a laborer was paid his monthly allotment of grain, he could use half of it to feed his family, and the other half he could take to the local market to barter for a tool, clothing, or pottery, using the standardized deben value as his guide. The stability of the entire system rested on the state's ability to consistently measure, collect, and redistribute these rations. Any disruption to the Nile's flood, and thus the grain supply, was not just a threat to food security, but a direct threat to the national currency and the state's ability to pay its workforce, which is precisely why the Pharaoh's granaries, managed by the ever-present scribes, were so critically important. If the Nile was the heart of the Egyptian economy, the bureaucracy was its brain. You cannot run a centralized economy based on perishable commodities without an army of meticulous accountants, and ancient Egypt had them in spades. The scribes were the unsung heroes of this entire system. They were the ones who truly transformed vast piles of grain and stacks of linen into a functioning national budget. Forget the image of a simple penman. The Egyptian scribe was a tax assessor, a bookkeeper, a treasury official, an auditor, all rolled into one. Their tools, the reed pen, the palette, and the papyrus or ostraca, pottery shards used for quick notes, were the essential instruments of economic control. Everything had to be recorded. The height of the Nile flood, the Nilometer readings, which directly predicted the coming harvest size and thus the tax rate, the acreage planted, the yield achieved, the tax collected, and every single outgoing payment made in the form of rations. This massive record-keeping effort made the state's control absolute and its ability to plan robust. When we talk about state control, we aren't talking about abstract regulation. We are talking about literally counting and documenting every sack of grain entering or leaving the royal or temple granaries. The granary was often guarded not just by soldiers, but by scribes whose job it was to ensure that the physical stock matched the written ledger. Their records, often kept on rolls of papyrus preserved in dry desert conditions, allow us a breathtakingly clear view into the ancient payroll system. We know, for example, that the standard daily wage for an unskilled laborer working on a royal tomb or a temple project was often 10 loaves of bread and 2 jars of beer. But since the state paid in rations, the grain was often distributed in its raw form to workers and their families, who would then process it into their daily food. This payment in kind meant the state did not have to worry about the logistics of mass producing and delivering the final products. They simply delivered the inputs. Let's focus for a moment on the crucial units of account that underpinned the system. As we mentioned, the actual currency of the masses was grain, measured in the unit called the khar. However, for higher value transactions, or for goods that needed a more universal and less perishable valuation, the Egyptians developed the deben. The deben was a fixed unit of weight, roughly 91 grams, and was initially tied to copper, though it could also be reckoned in silver or gold for very high-end goods. Crucially, the deben was an imaginary unit of value, a number on a ledger, not a coin in hand. Think of it like a price tag. If you wanted to buy a cow, the price might be 30 deben of copper. You, the buyer, did not necessarily need to have a 30 deben weight of copper. You could pay the seller with a variety of goods that, when their value was calculated by the scribe, equaled 30 deben. You might pay with 5 deben worth of quality linen, 10 deben worth of fine barley, and 15 deben worth of specialized tools. The scribes were essential here, as they maintained a widely accepted price list that allowed these complex barter transactions to occur smoothly. These lists formalized the exchange rates between seemingly disparate items like a basket of onions, a jar of incense, and a copper chisel, all based on their relative value in the theoretical deben. This level of standardization is what elevated the Egyptian system above simple, arbitrary barter. It created a true market economy built on calculated value, the ultimate display of the state's economic power, and the purpose of all this rigorous accounting was the ability to mobilize enormous amounts of labor. How did the Pharaoh pay the tens of thousands of skilled quarrymen, architects, stone haulers, and common laborers needed to construct the magnificent temples and pyramids? He paid them, of course, with grain delivered as rations. The state effectively mobilized the nation's surplus agricultural wealth, the grain collected as tax, to finance massive public works. This centralized financing meant that all citizens, through their tax payments, were essentially investing in the state's grandest projects. The laborers who built the pyramids were not enslaved people working for free, but highly organized, highly compensated workers, paid reliably in the most precious commodity of all, food. Archaeological evidence from worker villages, such as Deir el-Medina, shows a sophisticated economy where artisans were paid handsomely in rations, allowing them to participate in local market exchanges, even sometimes loaning grain to each other or using it to hire local services. The grain standard, therefore, facilitated both the macroeconomic feats of the state and the microeconomic reality of daily life, connecting the monumental to mundane in a truly seamless economic tapestry. If the scribe was the brain, the granary was the heart and stomach of the Egyptian economic system. These structures were far more than simple storage units. They were the physical banks, the emergency food reserves, the tax collection centers, and the payroll offices all wrapped into one. Built for stability and security, the granaries were typically large, conical, mud brick structures often clustered together within walled compounds, designed to protect the precious commodity, the national currency, from vermin, moisture, and thieves. The state's economic power was literally measured by the volume of grain within these walls. The management of these reserves was a matter of national security and economic stability. The system operated on a crucial understanding of risk management, entirely dependent on the Nile's unpredictable nature. While the annual flood was reliable, its height was not. A low flood meant drought, famine, and economic collapse. A flood that was too high meant ruined settlements and crop destruction. Therefore, the state's primary goal was to maintain a strategic reserve large enough to buffer the entire population against potential multi-year failures. This function elevated the pharaoh from a mere ruler to the divine provider, the one who ensured the continuity of life itself through his control of the grain. The process was rigorous and highly formalized. Once the harvest was complete, state officials and scribes would arrive to oversee the collection of taxes. The farmer's portion was measured, recorded, and sealed, then loaded onto barges or donkeys for transport to major state granaries, often located adjacent to capital city or a regional administrative center. Upon arrival, the grain was carefully measured again using standardized containers, and the weight and volume were meticulously recorded on papyrus. This process was so vital that reliefs on tomb walls often depict the official measurement process, sometimes including a scribe with his register, illustrating the administrative seriousness of the event. The pharaoh's name or seal would then be affixed to the granary door, symbolically placing the entire reserve under royal divine protection. This act confirmed that the grain was now part of the state's assets, ready to be redistributed as wages, used as a strategic buffer, or allocated to temple cults. This leads us directly to the crucial role of the temples. In ancient Egypt, the distinction between religious and economic life was practically non-existent. The great temple complexes, like the massive structures at Karnak, Thebes, or Abydos, were not just places of worship. They were enormous economic enterprises. They owned vast tracts of the most fertile land, cultivated by tenant farmers. They employed thousands of priests, craftsmen, bakers, brewers, and servants. And most importantly, they maintained their own huge, independent granaries. These temple granaries operated as regional economic hubs, functioning almost like independent, wealthy provinces within the state. They collected their own taxes, or rent, from their lands in the form of grain, and then used this grain to pay their own extensive staff. The temple economy was a major component of the overall national economy, often holding a significant portion of the total grain reserve. This symbiotic relationship meant the state, and the temples worked in tandem. The state protected the temples and allocated resources to them, and in return, the temples managed huge resources, employed vast numbers of people, and ensured the gods were pleased, thus guaranteeing the continuity of the Nile's bounty. In essence, the temples were major employers and crucial contributors to the stability of the grain standard by managing their own localized, large-scale systems of collection and redistribution. The stability achieved through this centralized control and massive reserve management cannot be overstated. By converting the unpredictable yield of the earth into a manageable, countable, and distributable standard, the grain, and by building secure, massive infrastructure, the granaries, to hold it, the Egyptians created a powerful, non-monetary financial system. This system ensured that even during years of local shortfall, the state had the ability to move grain from a surplus area to a deficit area, preventing widespread catastrophe and maintaining the peace and the pharaoh's authority. This constant, reliable availability of a basic medium of exchange is what allowed the specialized workforce, the sculptors, the goldsmiths, and the architects, to thrive, knowing they would always be reliably paid in the most valuable commodity of all. We can now turn our attention to how this system managed the most high-value goods, what happened when people wanted to trade internationally, and how the entire system eventually interacted with foreign coinage. While the vast majority of internal transactions, the daily economy of the market and the payment of wages, ran smoothly on the grain standard, the Egyptian state needed a way to value and acquire high-end commodities and to engage in international trade. It is impossible to pay a Phoenician merchant for a shipment of cedar logs or a Nubian caravan leader for gold dust using bulky, perishable sacks of barley. This necessity led to the increased importance of the metal units of account, primarily the copper and silver deben. Remember, the deben was an accounting unit, a standard weight of metal that served as a proxy for abstract value. For high-value goods like precious stones, fine metals, imported incense, or exotic wood, the price was universally expressed in deben of silver or copper. Silver, being rarer and imported, held a much higher value than copper, and both were far more valuable than the equivalent weight in grain. When a large transaction took place, the buyer and seller would agree on the price in deben. The actual payment might still be a complex mixture of goods, but the inclusion of metal, particularly copper ingots or silver rings of known weight, offered a highly portable and non-perishable means of payment that was universally trusted, especially in foreign markets. These metals, especially silver, which was often imported, functioned as a kind of high-level, standardized commodity money. They were not coins in the modern sense. They were not stamped with the image of a pharaoh or guaranteed by the state. Instead, they were valued purely by their weight and purity, which often had to be verified by a skilled metalsmith using scales. A transaction involving a large amount of silver would require the buyer to cut pieces from a silver ingot or loop, weigh them out precisely, and the seller would confirm the purity. This use of weighed metal facilitated trade with their neighbors, like the Minoans, Mycenaeans, and the people of the Near East, who also understood the value of metals by weight. The Egyptian economy thus had two tiers: the bulk tier, the grain standard, for internal consumption and labor, and the metal tier, the deben standard, for luxury goods and foreign commerce. This dual system allowed the grain-based domestic economy to remain stable and insulated from external volatility while enabling essential international connections. This incredible stability, however, was fundamentally challenged after the late period and definitively so during the Ptolemaic era, following the conquest by Alexander the Great in 332 BC. The Greeks brought with them a radically new concept: coin money. Unlike the carefully weighed silver deben, a coin was a piece of metal, usually silver or gold, that was stamped by a state authority, guaranteeing both its weight and its purity. This stamp eliminated the need to weigh the metal for every single transaction, massively increasing the speed and efficiency of commerce. This was a paradigm shift. Initially, the native Egyptian economy was resistant to the change. The vast internal structure of taxation, granaries, and the payment of state wages was so deeply entrenched in the grain standard that it couldn't be dismantled overnight. The Ptolemaic rulers, therefore, introduced a sophisticated, hybrid system. They maintained the state's monopoly on production and distribution of grain, continuing to collect most taxes in kind and pay most workers in rations. However, they also established a royal monopoly over coinage and required certain transactions, especially fees and high-value taxes, to be paid in silver coin. This forced integration meant that Egyptians had to interact with the currency system. Farmers, for example, might still pay their rent in barley, but then might need to sell a portion of that barley on the open market to acquire the silver coins necessary to pay certain mandatory government fees. The introduction of coinage created a monetized sector within the grain economy. This system was not just about convenience. It was a powerful tool for the Ptolemaic state. By controlling the minting of coins and controlling the fixed rate at which grain could be converted into silver, the government effectively managed the entire money supply and the national price level. They could even manipulate the economy by changing the official exchange rates between the silver coin drachmas and the grain standard. While the common person continued to think of value in terms of the number of grain sacks they could acquire, the state's financial ledgers began to track value increasingly in silver, signifying the slow inevitable transition away from a pure grain standard to a complex, bimetallic system that leveraged the efficiency of coinage while relying on the ancient stability of the Nile's bounty. The monumental pyramids were built on barley. The Hellenistic cities were built with silver coins, demonstrating the evolution of an economic giant. The story of the ancient Egyptian grain standard is ultimately a testament to economic ingenuity born of necessity and environmental constraint. For nearly 3,000 years, this system provided a foundation of unparalleled stability for one of the world's most enduring civilizations. It managed to mobilize vast resources, feed armies, pay laborers, finance monumental architecture, and sustain complex urban centers, all without the use of widely circulated currency. Its efficiency lay precisely in its simplicity and its direct link to the primary source of wealth, the land. The core strength of the system was its capacity for risk mitigation. By centralizing the collection of agricultural surplus into massive, state-controlled granaries, the pharaoh and his administration effectively pooled the national risk. This collective management ensured that a localized crop failure did not turn into a regional famine, allowing the state to function as an insurance provider for its entire populace. This level of comprehensive social security, based purely on food reserves, is a remarkable achievement that modern economies, with all their financial complexity, often struggle to replicate. Furthermore, using grain as a standard ensured that the currency itself had inherent, immediate utility. You couldn't hoard it indefinitely, and its value was tied not to a volatile precious metal market, but to the constant, essential need for sustenance. This grounded the economy in a profound, tangible reality. However, the system was not without its drawbacks, and these very issues ultimately contributed to its decline. The massive centralization required an enormous, often slow and costly bureaucracy. The sheer logistical challenge of collecting, measuring, transporting, storing, and redistributing millions of bushels of grain across vast distances was immense. Furthermore, the system was vulnerable to corruption and mismanagement. While the scribes were vital, they also held immense power, and records show periodic issues with officials skimming from the granaries, misreporting yields, or falsely adjusting rations. As the Egyptian empire expanded and contracted, the state's ability to maintain rigid control over distant agricultural estates also fluctuated, leading to periods of decentralization where regional temples or local nomarchs held greater economic power than the central pharaoh. The final phase of the system's decline, as we noted, was a slow but inexorable rise of coin money under the Ptolemies and later the Romans. Roman rule brought an even greater reliance on coinage, viewing Egypt primarily as the breadbasket of the empire. The Romans continued to centralize control over grain, but they did so with a much heavier emphasis on coinage, forcing the majority of transactions into a monetized framework. The vast quantities of Egyptian grain were no longer just for the Egyptian people. They were destined for Rome and its legions. The grain standard, which had functioned as the nation's currency for 3 millennia, transitioned fully into a commodity to be exported for external gain. The state's control of the grain shifted from being a mechanism of internal economic stability and social security to being a tool of imperial profit. In closing, the ancient Egyptian grain standard provides a profound historical case study. It demonstrates a sophisticated, stable, and powerful economy can exist entirely without minted coinage, relying instead on a standardized, essential, and controlled commodity. It stands as a monumental example of how human innovation, when confronted with a fundamental challenge of survival, the need to feed, house, and organize millions, can create a massive, enduring state apparatus. The pharaoh's ability to harness the predictable rhythm of the Nile, formalize the value of its yield with the stroke of a scribe's reed pen, and house that value in massive mud brick banks allowed them to build a civilization that defied the sands of time. The pyramids were paid for in barley, and that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson of all about the true power and weight of a centralized, managed economy. We have discussed how the state mobilized its grain wealth for massive public works, but let's now shrink the focus to the daily reality of the worker. To understand the success of the grain standard, you must understand the economy of the royal workforce, which was arguably the most visible and well-documented component of the state payroll. The most famous example of this microeconomy is the village of Deir el-Medina, the home of the artisans and craftsmen who carved and decorated the tombs in the Valley of the Kings during the New Kingdom. The records from this site offer an unparalleled window into the day-to-day use of the grain standard as currency. These skilled workers, the stonemasons, painters, and sculptors, were essential state employees, and their pay was significantly higher and more varied than that of the average field laborer. A foreman, for instance, might be paid $5 frac, $1.2 khar of emmer wheat, and $2 khar of barley per month, while a common workman might receive $4 khar of emmer and $1 frac, $1.2 khar of barley. This ration was a comprehensive salary, often including beer, vegetables, fish, and fuel, but the grain was the largest component by value and volume, acting as the primary medium of exchange. The grain provided by the state was both the means of subsistence and the capital for their personal economic activity. Because these workers were paid in bulk grain and other essential goods, they quickly became participants in a robust local barter market. They didn't need coins because they had their rations. If a workman needed a new shirt, he might use a portion of his monthly barley ration to trade with a linen weaver. If his tools needed sharpening, he might offer some of the state-provided fish or vegetables to the local metalsmith. The value of these goods was always referenced back to the deben accounting unit, allowing for fair and standardized trade. For example, a quality wooden bed might be valued at $25 deben. A workman might pay for it using a mixture of goods and services at total $25 deben, even if no copper or silver exchange hands. The scribe of the village would often act as a de facto notary, recording these complex exchanges and ensuring trust between parties. Crucially, the grain standard also allowed for a sophisticated system of credit and debt. If a workman had an emergency or wanted to acquire a large, expensive item, say a donkey or a high-quality jar of oil, he often didn't have the full amount of goods on hand. He could borrow grain from a wealthier neighbor, a temple, or even the village foreman, establishing a debt that was recorded on an ostracon, a piece of pottery or limestone shard. The debt would be precisely quantified in terms of deben or khar grain, and the borrower was expected to repay it with future rations. We have examples of these IOUs clearly documenting interest rates and repayment schedules, proving that this was a dynamic and financially literate population operating entirely on a non-monetary standard. This system, however, brought the workers into direct and sometimes antagonistic contact with the state's logistical realities. When the state's massive supply chain faltered, whether due to corrupt officials diverting rations, slow bureaucracy, or a poor harvest, the workers suffered immediately. The ultimate economic protest in ancient Egypt was a strike. The records of Deir el-Medina document one of the earliest known labor strikes in human history, occurring during the reign of Ramses III. The workmen, hungry and unpaid due to delays in the delivery of their grain rations, put down their tools and marched on the temple granaries, shouting, "We are hungry." This event dramatically illustrates that the state's social contract was simple. You provide labor, we provide the bread. When the grain standard failed to deliver, the entire system of authority and control was threatened, highlighting just how fundamentally the stability of the state rested on the smooth and timely distribution of that single commodity. This microeconomy proves that the grain standard was not a crude or primitive system, but a highly sophisticated, standardized, and adaptable model that facilitated everything from complex debt arrangements to labor disputes, all based on a simple measure of a basket of grain. For an economy based on complex barter, credit, and standardized units of account, trust and enforceability are paramount. In the absence of state-guaranteed coinage, the legal system and pervasive use of written contracts filled this role, giving the grain standard its necessary legal weight. The scribes, again, were not just accountants. They were the essential legal notaries and record keepers who ensured the economic gears didn't grind to a halt due to disputes. In ancient Egypt, almost every significant economic transaction, especially those involving credit, land transfer, or a large amount of goods, was formalized through a written contract. These documents, primarily written on papyrus, often followed a precise legal format that defined the exact terms of the exchange. The value of the goods being exchanged was always stipulated in the standardized unit, the deben, even if the payment itself was made in a basket of barley, a piece of linen, or a cow. For instance, a contract of sale of a house would state the price as perhaps $100 deben of silver value, and then meticulously list the items the buyer provided to meet that value. paid with $10 sacks of fine barley, valued at $10 deben, $5 copper tools, valued at $15 deben, and $75 deben worth of specialized fish oil. This reliance on a written word made the deben, and by extension, the underlying value of grain, a legally binding concept. The legal framework was particularly crucial for managing debt and credit. We have extensive records of loan agreements which illustrate the high degree of financial sophistication. If a farmer borrowed grain from a temple to survive a lean year, the contract would specify the exact amount of grain borrowed in khar, the repayment date, and often the interest rate, which was usually expressed as a percentage of the principal and was also paid in kind more grain. For example, a loan might require the borrower to return $110 khar next harvest for $100 khar borrowed, representing a 10% interest rate, a rate that was surprisingly reasonable by ancient standards. If the borrower defaulted, the contract provided a mechanism for the state to seize property or, in extreme cases, compel labor until the debt was satisfied. The legal system thus secured the capital investment in the grain standard, encouraging lending and preventing the market from seizing up due to lack of confidence. Furthermore, the legal status of tax receipts was incredibly important. When a farmer paid his grain tax, the state official would issue a sealed receipt. This receipt served two purposes. First, it was proof of payment to prevent double taxation, and second, it could sometimes be used as a form of quasi-currency or collateral. A farmer who had a tax receipt might be considered more creditworthy, as the receipt guaranteed he had fulfilled his obligations to the state. In some instances, these receipts may have been temporarily used in exchanges, functioning as a primitive form of transferable claim against the state's recognized authority, demonstrating a subtle overlap between the state's fiscal records and daily commercial life. The system of land tenure was also intrinsically linked to the grain standard. While the pharaoh theoretically owned all land, much of it was managed by temples or individuals. The use of this land was often granted in exchange for an annual fixed rent, paid entirely in kind, usually in grain. The lease contracts were highly detailed, stipulating the amount of grain due, the exact nature of the yield, e.g., clean, threshed barley of the finest grade, and the penalties for late or incomplete payment. This constant stream of legally enforced grain payments was the main driver that kept the temple granaries full and the entire, sprawling redistribution system constantly supplied. In summary, the Egyptian economy was a masterpiece of administrative standardization and legal enforcement. The use of writing and contracts transformed the volatility of an agricultural commodity into a reliable, legally defined standard of value, allowing for sophisticated economic planning and complex personal finance. The stability of the grain standard wasn't just physical, it was legally institutionalized. The colossal scale of the Egyptian economy meant that the movement of goods was a logistical challenge that dwarfed any contemporary system. Because the state's currency was bulky, perishable grain, the entire nation's wealth had to be constantly in motion, flowing from the fields to the granaries, and then from the granaries to places where it was consumed as wages. The Nile River was not just a source of life. It was a national supply chain infrastructure, the supreme economic highway upon which the grain standard flowed. The annual harvest cycle dictated the rhythm of transport. Once the grain was collected from the fields of Upper and Lower Egypt and registered by the scribes, it was immediately packaged into standardized woven sacks. These sacks were then loaded onto the backs of donkeys for the short haul to the nearest riverbank. This last-mile logistics was vital but labor-intensive. From there, the real movement began, utilizing the unique geography of Egypt. The genius of Egyptian river transport lies in the dual directionality of the Nile. Because the prevailing winds blow south upriver, a boat sailing south could use its sails to push against the current. Conversely, a boat traveling north downriver could simply drop its mast and rely on the current to carry it toward the Nile Delta. This natural, perpetual conveyor belt meant that grain could be transported efficiently in both directions with minimal effort or fuel beyond human power for maneuvering. Without this geographical advantage, the logistics of a grain-based economy of this scale would have been practically impossible. The vessels used for this commerce were specialized river barges. These were large, flat-bottomed wooden boats, built to maximize capacity for carrying heavy, bulky loads like stone and, most importantly, grain. Royal decrees often specified the number of barges and the volume of grain to be moved from one region to another, reflecting the state's tight control over the distribution network. The movement of these grain shipments was tracked with the same rigor as the accounting in the granaries. Scribes were often stationed at key river ports to record every barge that passed, detailing its cargo, its origin, and its final destination. This was necessary to ensure that the grain allocated for paying the workmen at the Theban necropolis, for example, did not get diverted by a local official at a town halfway upriver. The final destination of these shipments was typically a major redistribution center. These were large complexes adjacent to temples, royal workshops, or administrative capitals. Here, the grain was offloaded, inspected for quality, and stored in the central granaries we discussed earlier. From these central points, the grain would be continually drawn out and processed. The most immediate and critical use was turning the grain into the staple wages, bread and beer. Every major administrative center had massive state or temple-run bakeries and breweries. These facilities were essential components of the economic infrastructure, turning the raw currency, grain, into the final consumable currency, rations. The grain was ground, fermented, and baked by specialized laborers who were themselves paid in rations. The quality and size of the bread and beer were also standardized. Hieroglyphic texts confirm that workers received fixed daily allotments of specific types and sizes of bread and jars of beer, guaranteeing a standardized nutritional and caloric wage. This constant process of milling, baking, and brewing consumed vast amounts of labor and resources, but was the only way to deliver the payment in a form that was immediately useful to the recipient. In essence, the entire system relied on a perfectly synchronized network of fields, donkeys, barges, scribes, granaries, and bakeries. A disruption at any point, a blockage in the river, a breakdown in the barge fleet, or a shortfall in the labor needed for milling, could paralyze the local economy. The massive logistical undertaking of moving a nation's currency every year highlights the incredible organizational power of the centralized Egyptian state, making the Nile the true lifeblood of the grain standard and the engine of its stability. To truly grasp the scale of the grain standard economy, we must recognize that the state's economic activity was largely mirrored and amplified by the wealth and control of the great temple estates. These temples, especially those dedicated to powerful gods like Amun-Ra at Karnak, were far more than just religious centers. They were the single largest landowners and employers outside of the royal administration itself. They were, in effect, massive autonomous economic corporations operating under a divine mandate. The temples acquired their wealth through a combination of royal endowments and direct agricultural production. Over centuries, successive pharaohs would dedicate vast tracts of prime agricultural land, often along with the thousands of people who worked that land, to the service of a specific god. This made the temples the largest recipients and managers of the nation's core economic asset, the fertile land that produced the grain. The temple estate operated its own internal version of the grain standard economy. It had its own scribes, its own vast granaries, its own workshops, its own cattle herds, and its own supply chain to feed its enormous staff. The internal economy of a major temple was staggering. The records from a new kingdom show that a major temple might employ tens of thousands of people, including not just priests and high officials, but also specialized artisans, weavers, brewers, bakers, farmers, and foreign slaves captured during military campaigns. All these employees were paid, just like the royal laborers, in a fixed system of daily rations, primarily grain, converted into bread and beer. The sheer volume of grain required to sustain the staff, and the daily rituals of feeding the gods, who were believed to consume offerings of food and drink, meant that the temple's granaries had to be continually replenished and audited. The wealth of the temple also served as a secondary, localized economic safety net. While the royal granaries served the state, the temple granaries were often seen as a local resource. In times of local hardship or bureaucratic delay from the central government, the temple might dispense grain from its reserves to the surrounding community or its workers, thus acting as a crucial stabilizer in the regional economy. This gave the priesthood immense local power and influence, often making the local high priest a figure of economic authority, second only to the regional governor, nomarch. The pharaoh, while granting the temple's land and resources, maintained a crucial link. He was still the ultimate intermediary between the gods and the people. Therefore, the temples were often subject to royal audits and levies. The state could and did draw upon the temple substantial reserves of grain, metals, and finished goods to fund military campaigns, building projects, or to alleviate a national famine. This mechanism ensured that while the temples were economically powerful, their wealth ultimately remained subservient to the needs of the central state. The taxes collected by the state were often redistributed to the temples as endowments, and the wealth collected by the temples was often partially redirected back to the state during times of need. It was symbiotic, yet often tense, financial relationship, where the vast grain reserves provided the liquid capital for both the secular and sacred arms of the government. In conclusion, the temple economy was not merely a passive recipient of state funds. It was an active participant and a monumental driver of the grain standard. By controlling a massive share of the nation's fertile land and employing a huge, salaried workforce paid in grain rations, the temples amplified the centralized economic model, providing an additional layer of stability and complexity to the Egyptian financial landscape. Their dual role as spiritual centers and colossal economic hubs is a unique and defining feature of the grain-based political economy. In an economy where the unit of account deben was distinct from the physical medium of exchange grain, the primary economic challenge was maintaining value stability and preventing wild market fluctuations. Since the state controlled the largest reserves of the national currency, grain, and was the largest employer and tax collector, the Egyptian economy was, by its very nature, a managed or a planned economy where prices were often centrally fixed. Instead of relying on supply and demand to set market rates for staple goods, the scribal bureaucracy maintained extensive official price lists. These lists established the exchange rate between the deben, the unit of value, and hundreds of different commodities, effectively fixing the price of everything from a copper axe and a cow to a jar of honey and a day's labor. For example, the official price list might state that one quality linen sheet was equivalent to $4 deben of copper value, and that $10 sacks of barley were also equivalent to $4 deben. By standardizing these rates, the state ensured that complex barter could proceed smoothly and fairly across the entire country, thus giving every commodity a stable, agreed-upon value in relation to the universal yardstick, the deben. This system provided a powerful defense against traditional inflation as we understand it today. In modern economies, inflation is often defined as too much money chasing too few goods, causing the value of the currency to fall. The Egyptian state, however, maintained a tight control over both the supply of the physical currency, grain, and the official value assigned to it. Since the state held a monopoly on the largest reserves and dictated the rates of exchange, it could, in theory, keep prices stable for centuries, and indeed, they largely succeeded in doing so. However, the Egyptian system was vulnerable to an equivalent form of economic instability, supply shock. Because the currency was a perishable agricultural commodity, its volume was entirely dependent on the Nile flood. A disastrously low flood immediately created a severe currency shortage. This didn't devalue the deben as an abstract unit, but it made the physical currency, the grain, extremely scarce. In such periods of famine, the real-world value of a sack of grain would skyrocket on the local black market, even if the official scribal price list remained unchanged. People would be willing to pay drastically more in other goods, linen, copper, labor, for that scarce grain. These periods of crisis represented the state's failure to adequately buffer the economy against environmental shocks, leading to temporary but often devastating price volatility and breakdown of the official fixed rates. Furthermore, the state had a sophisticated way of managing the supply of its other key unit of account, copper. The copper deben was stable because the state largely controlled its mining and supply. When the state needed to inject value into the economy for large purchases or foreign trade, it could release more copper ingots of known deben weight from its treasuries. When it needed to pull value out of the economy, it would collect more of the copper as taxes or levies. This manipulation of the copper supply, the non-perishable store of wealth, was the closest the Pharaohs came conducting modern monetary policy, aimed at maintaining the long-term stability of the abstract deben standard against fluctuations in agricultural output. In essence, The Egyptian economic model was a remarkable exercise in centralized economic planning. It sacrificed the dynamism of a free-floating price system for the immense stability and predictability required to run a massive, long-lasting civilization built on agricultural surplus. The system proved that stability, rather than high growth, was the ultimate value proposition for the economy of the Pharaohs. The Egyptian economy was not static. The core principle of the grain standard remained, but the methods of control, collection, and redistribution underwent significant changes in response to political centralism, decentralization, and imperial expansion. Examining these shifts reveals the resilience and flexibility of the system. The Old Kingdom, circa 2686 to 2181 BCE, the zenith of centralization. The Old Kingdom, the age of the Great Pyramid builders, represents the most centralized and tightly controlled phase of the grain standard. During this period, the Pharaoh's authority was virtually absolute, and the central administration effectively managed the entire national economy. Total control. The state exercised nearly total control over agricultural land and the labor force. The purpose of this control was singular: to mobilize the immense resources, the grain and the manpower it funded, needed for the monumental royal building projects. The construction of the Giza pyramids was the ultimate expression of the centralized grain standard economy at work, requiring an unparalleled annual surplus and precise logistical management of rations for tens of thousands of workers. Taxation in granaries. Tax collection was ruthlessly efficient, focused primarily on grain and livestock. The state granaries were directly managed by the vizier, the Pharaoh's chief minister, and served as a single treasury for the entire nation. Regional nomarchs, governors, had less independent power, ensuring the bulk of the economic wealth flowed directly to the capital, usually Memphis. Simplicity of exchange. The economy was relatively simple, with fewer imports and a heavy reliance on direct, state-issued rations. The focus was on internal stability and massive, state-directed consumption. The first intermediate period in Middle Kingdom, circa 2181 to 1782 BCE, decentralization and legal codification. The collapse of the Old Kingdom ushered in the first intermediate period, characterized by political decentralization. This turbulent era profoundly impacted the economic model. Rise of nomarchs. Regional governors gained vast control, effectively turning their provincial capitals into independent economic centers. They collected their own taxes, managed local granaries, and maintained local armies. This decentralization meant that the flow of grain and wealth to the central authority dried up, leading to internal strife and localized famines when regional reserves failed. Middle Kingdom recentralization. The subsequent Middle Kingdom saw the pharaohs reasserting central authority. However, they did not completely dismantle the nomarch's power. Instead, they adapted the system. While the state again demanded its share of taxes, regional temples and local powerful families retained significant land holdings and their own granaries. Legal formalization. This era saw a significant increase in written legal contracts concerning land tenure, inheritance, and debt. This formalized the economy and was necessary to provide stability and trust between increasingly independent economic actors, the temples, the local governors, and the central state, all of whom were still operating on the grain standard. The rules governing the deben and khar became more explicit and legally binding to navigate this more complex, multi-layered economic reality. The New Kingdom, circa 1550 to 1070 BCE, imperial wealth and market sophistication. The New Kingdom, the era of pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramses II, was the age of empire, which brought unprecedented foreign wealth and complexity to the grain standard. Imperial income. Foreign conquest and trade brought in massive amounts of gold, silver, and copper as tribute and spoil. While the internal economy still ran on grain, the state's treasuries were awash in precious metals. This increased the importance of the metal deben as a unit for large-scale state accounting and international transactions. Wider economic gap. The payment of high salaries to specialized workers, like those at Deir el-Medina, and the influx of luxury goods created a more vibrant, dynamic, and potentially unequal market economy. Workers with high grain ration could afford to buy more goods, driving local barter markets to a higher level of activity and sophistication. Introduction of silver. Silver, though always valued, became much more common as a medium of high-value exchange, operating alongside gold and copper. While not coin money, The use of silver rings and scraps, weighed precisely, became the default for purchasing foreign goods or large domestic items. This foreshadowed the eventual introduction of coinage, proving that the grain standard, while foundational, was flexible enough to incorporate new forms of non-perishable value. Through these phases, the grain standard proved to be a remarkably stable foundation, adapting to shifts from centralized autocracy to decentralized regionalism, and finally to a wealthy, imperial power. It was the constant, reliable measure of value that transcended the political turmoil of 2 millennia. Let us conclude this lecture by diving into the hard numbers, the specific mathematics that allowed the scribes to make the grain standard a precise and workable system, using the units of the deben and the khar. This focus on measurement and calculation is what truly elevated the Egyptian economy from simple barter to a functioning financial system. The precision of the Egyptian economy relied entirely on standardized, verifiable units of measurement, allowing scribes to accurately compare the value of a sack of barley against a copper tool or a roll of linen. To understand the calculations, we must first grasp the core units. The khar, or the equivalent volume measure known as a sack, was a fundamental unit of volume for grain, the physical measure of the currency. While its exact volume varied slightly across different eras, it was consistently around $76.8 liters, or approximately 2 bushels. This khar was a standardized unit used for everything from large-scale trade to taxation. The farmer's tax obligation was calculated as a percentage of his estimated yield, always paid in khar of wheat or barley. Crucially, the payment of wages or ration payment was also issued in a specified number of khar grain or fractions thereof. The scribe's mathematical acumen was essential here because they didn't just deal with a large khar. They used subunits like the heket, about $4.8 liters, or $1/16 carat $H of khar, to measure the small daily portions of grain distributed as rations. Calculating the total annual payroll for tens of thousands of workers required converting the monthly khar payment down to the daily heket allocation, and then back up to the required annual withdrawal from a granary. This administrative feat of volume conversion demonstrated the high level of mathematical literacy needed to sustain the state. Parallel to the khar, the deben, dben, was the primary unit of weight and, by extension, the universal unit of account. It was the abstract dollar or euro of the Egyptian economy. The deben weighed approximately $91 grams, roughly $3.2 ounces, and was most frequently linked to copper for mid-level value and silver for high-level value. A simple tool might be valued at $1 deben of copper. A valuable piece of jewelry might be valued at $1 deben of silver. Given that silver was often imported, $1 deben of silver was frequently worth $100 times the value of $1 deben of copper. The scribe's most complex and vital task was establishing and maintaining the exchange rate between the volume of the perishable currency, khar grain, and the weight of the abstract value unit, deben of metal. This ratio was the heart of the system's stability. During much of the New Kingdom, a widely accepted standard exchange rate was established, which can be summarized financially as $10 sacks khar of barley were roughly equivalent to the value of $1 deben of copper. This established a financial constant. If a commodity was valued at $5 deben of copper, a farmer could instantly know he needed to pay for it by delivering $50 khar of barley. This formula allowed the entire market to function, even for complex barter transactions. Consider a high-quality ox priced at $120 deben of copper. A buyer, perhaps an artisan who gets paid in grain, does not necessarily possess the copper. Instead, the scribe calculates the required barley. $120 deben multiplied by the conversion factor of $10 khar per deben equals $200 khar barley. But the transaction could be even more complex. The buyer might pay $500 khar barley, and the remainder in other goods. For example, 5 fine linen garments, each valued at $20 deben, would total $100 deben equivalent, or $1,000 khar equivalent. The remaining $200 khar equivalent might be paid in copper tools. The entire transaction, involving multiple goods, is meticulously documented, with all goods converted mathematically to the common deben unit and recorded by the scribe. This mathematical rigor ensured that the economic system, built upon a foundation of perishable crops and bulky metal weights, was as precise and accountable as any modern financial system. It was this detailed calculation, recorded on countless ostraca and papyri, that gave the grain standards enduring power and stability across the vast chronology of ancient Egypt.